Alright, it's time for another update and forecast on the various wildfires going on in California. You can see just based on the satellite imagery some of the wildfires that we have to talk about. We have, of course, the Caldor Fire here, which has been one of the more active wildfires over the last couple of days. You can see the Dixie Fire started to pick up this afternoon, although I would say for the most part, better conditions right now than we have seen throughout most of our updates on the Dixie Fire in the past, although certainly still some smoke coming off there, so we will take a close look at that one. You can see less behavior coming off of the Mcfarland and the Monument today, although still some hotspots showing up on the Monument and the river complex as well. And then we also have the Antelope Fire all the way up in far northern California, and then the French Fire as well, which is one that we haven't talked about in previous videos, but we will take a brief look at throughout this video. So, based on this satellite imagery, it looks like the two big fires that we're going to be talking about today and spending the most time on are the Caldor Fire and the Dixie Fire. So, one interesting thing to do would be just to look at the hotspots, see where the current hotspots are in relation to the fire perimeter on those two fires in particular, to see where a lot of that growth has been over the last couple of days. You can see with the Dixie Fire, it's been mostly burning in the northwestern corner here. You can see some of those hotspots outside of that previous fire perimeter, where in the past we had those northerly winds pushing down a lot of that fire behavior in the past couple of days, and then that northern section has started to pick up more recently as we've switched back to more southerly winds. And then on the more eastern edge of the fire, you can see that hotspot is still a factor and still seeing some activity just to the southwest of Honey Lake. I do know that that fire did get somewhat close to the Milford area, but as of right now, the last report I was seeing, it sounded like they were just basically mopping up, putting in some more containment lines, focusing on structure protection there, but that is an area I continue to watch moving forward. And then one of the key spots to watch on the Dixie Fire is that area around Taylorsville. I know this is a part of the fire where they are actually suppressing the fire using direct suppression efforts. So the big difference there is direct and indirect. Direct is where you are actually on the front of that fire and actively trying to suppress it. Indirect is where you're maybe a couple of miles away, just building some fire lines just in case the fire gets there. So I know on that Taylorsville area, that is a key spot that we have been looking at in previous videos. They are actively working on suppressing that fire there, and based on the weather forecast the last couple of days and going through the next couple of days, I would say the overall summary for our wildfires is better conditions this week than we had last week. Last week, we had some of those red flag warnings coming in. We had some wind gusts up to 35, 40 miles per hour, and temperatures relatively warm as well. This week, overall, is looking like cooler temperatures and less extreme winds, but just given the satellite imagery that we were looking at earlier, certainly do still have some fire behavior going on, which we do have to talk about. Now, I think what has been the most active fire over the last maybe 48 hours has been the Caldor Fire, where you can see lots of activity up on the northeastern edge of that one, and it did jump Highway 50 in that one section right there. Good to see that it has started to calm down on the southern and western edges right there, though. I know that's one of the key places that they were trying to get some containment early on so that they're able to start to work their way around the fire, flank up, and hopefully gain more containment there. Big things to talk about on Caldor Fire moving forward are this western section that is the closest to all those thousands of structures we see in places like Pleasant Valley or Camino. And then we're also going to, and one thing I will say on that western section is we do have some firing operations planned there. So that will help to secure this side of the perimeter, hopefully burn out some of those fuels so that it can't move any farther west into those structures. But then you do also see how much we've been burning up on the northeastern section there, And given the predominant wind direction is mostly from the southwest, I would say that northeastern section is my main concern for the Caldor Fire moving forward. So just looking at the active hotspots, that's usually one of the best things to look at. Looking at the Dixie Fire right now, clearly we do still have those key hotspots that kind of matched up perfectly with that fire perimeter map we were looking at. You can see those hotspots around Taylorsville. That's, again, one of the key areas on the Dixie Fire that I'm going to be watching over the next couple of days. That is an area where CAL FIRE has positioned a large amount of resources. They're, like I said, actively trying to suppress this fire using direct methods, so they're right on the fire line, trying to keep those hotspots out of Taylorsville. And the good thing is that the weather seems to be cooperating with us much more over the next few days than it was over last week, especially when we had some of those critical fire weather conditions coming in. Then you can also see the remnants of that hotspot, the one that did work its way into Janesville at one point. We did see some structures destroyed in that area, but compared to my last update, which again was a while ago, sorry for the long interlude between updates. I think my last one was Thursday night. Focused on some personal things over this weekend, but back right now, and I should be back every single day this week. So just one of the key things I want to point out here is last time we were looking at these active hotspot maps, this hotspot, the one that was the spot fire that worked its way into Janesville, we were seeing a lot of activity on that one. We had those northerly winds pushing it into Milford, and as of right now, it looks like that one is barely even burning anymore. And if we look at the structures, you can see that's where we were starting to get a little worried as that hotspot was moving farther south here. And I want to see what it looks like with the fire perimeter. Looks like for the most part they were able to keep it out of where we see a lot of those structures on the southern shore of Honey Lake. And that was some great news because that was one of our key concerns in our last update, as we had those northerly winds pushing that fire closer and closer to these structures. Looks like CAL FIRE did a great job of keeping that fire out of Milford, and given the live hotspots, looks like things are still trending in the right direction. But again, that's one of my key areas of concern. Just looking at the smoke coming off of there earlier today, you can see minimal this morning, and then we started to pick up in the afternoon hours as we got warmer, slightly windier, and you notice the direction this smoke is going is much different than my last update. My last update, we still had those northerly winds. It was blowing all that smoke directly down into California. A lot of our fire activity was on the southern edges of the fire, but you can see those winds have shifted around more southwesterly right now, and that's why those winds are pushing that smoke up to the northeast, which again is some good news for air quality when it comes to the Bay Area or our valleys. But you can see that the French fire has those same southerly winds, so the smoke that's produced there is able to find its way into the valley. That's why we do still have some smoke and haze throughout California. But again, looks like the two key spots on the Dixie Fire were that spot around Taylorsville and especially on that northwestern section of the fire. So I want to look at the hotspots there for just a brief second, because you can see that is the area of the Dixie Fire where we do have the most activity going on right now. But I will point out that where we see a lot of that fire behavior going on in the northwestern section, not very close to a large amount of structures. For example, comparing that hotspot and the you do see some structures around there represented with those orange dots that I'll flash on and off so you can see them. Some structures around there, but not too many. Where we were really concerned on this fire was, I'll remind you, we had that hotspot on the to the north of Lake Almanor, where with those northerly winds started to get a little scary at some points, where we had those northerly winds pushing the fire farther south towards these structures on Lake Almanor. Looks like we have very minimal activity going on there anymore. Last update I had, we had hotspots moving closer and closer to Westwood. Looks like a lot of that fire behavior has calmed down, so some good news there. And then quite possibly the best news is where we had all of these structures in places like Susanville and Janesville, there was a period of time where things were looking fairly bad there, especially when we had that one spot fire start to work its way into Janesville. Again, we did have some structures destroyed there, but Cal Fire did an amazing job of stopping that fire in its tracks, and then once those north winds came in, it started to push that hotspot away from Janesville. And then I'll also remind you, we had a lot of fire activity right here where my cursor is. And there was one period of time where we had southwest winds at about 35 to 40 miles per hour, moving it closer and closer to Susanville, and never ended up getting into the area of Susanville. And it looks like a lot of that activity has calmed down. So overall, I would say overall good news for the Dixie Fire. It looks like the areas around Lake Almanor, the areas around Westwood, Susanville, and Janesville are looking much, much better than my last update. But with that being said, we do still have a large amount of activity going on in this northwestern section, and we do still have some of those hot spots around Taylorsville that we are going to have to keep an eye on as we move forward in time, because we do still have some activity there. You could see it in the satellite imagery throughout the day today. Looked like it was calm this morning, and then as always, as you get into those afternoon hours where the winds pick up, that's where the fire activity starts to pick up. So we will be keeping an eye on those spots, although overall Dixie Fire looking better than previous days. And when we take a look at the weather forecast, it looks like the next 3 days are going to be much, much better than some of that activity that we had last week. So current fire behavior, relatively good on the Dixie Fire. Fire weather forecast, which we'll look at in a second, relatively good for all of our wildfires, at least comparatively, where it's still summer in California and all our fuels are still critically dry. So we are still going to see some growth on our fires over the next few days. Don't get me wrong. I'm just happy to see that it doesn't look like we'll be seeing those critical red flag warning conditions like we saw last week. But where some of the bad news does come in on the Dixie Fire is when you look at the current acreage burned, that is up to 725,000 acres burned. And I hadn't pulled up this link, but I do want to show how that compares with other wildfires in California. You can see that the Dixie is the number 2 largest wildfire in the history of California, or should say recorded history of California, just behind the August complex, which burned 1 million acres last year. And I think the key thing to point out when you think about the fact that the Dixie Fire is number 2 on this list is that it's really majority of that growth has happened before the peak of wildfire season. I'd really say that we're just basically getting into the peak of wildfire season right now and then moving forward from this period of time. So it's fairly significant that we saw a fire burn 725,000 acres before the peak of wildfire season. And unfortunately, as you could see on that satellite imagery today, Dixie Fire is not done. We're most likely going to continue to see that number rise into the future. I would be interested to see if we end up taking over the August complex for the largest wildfire in the history of California. It looks like we do have some room for continued growth on that northwestern section where we have a lot of activity going on there, but really when it comes to how much all of these fires are going to continue to burn into the future, really just comes down to the weather and if it decides to cooperate, which it looks like it might be doing over the next few days. But as we've seen with a lot of these fires throughout the course of this season, that weather can turn on a dime, and then a fire that looked contained all of a sudden takes off once again. That is one key story on the Dixie Fire. There was one point on the Dixie Fire where it looked like we were almost towards the end of it. It looked like we had some good containment. We had some great firing operations on the northern section here. It was really just where my cursor is right here. And then in one day, we had some 95-degree temperatures come back in, some relative humidity in the single digits, and some wind gusts up to 35 miles per hour led to some spot fires. And you can see how much the Dixie Fire has continued to burn since then. Like I said, up to 750,000 acres. Now, where some good news comes in is the containment number is up from the last time that I gave an update. We're up to 40% right there, and interested to see where we picked up some of that containment. It looks like, again, majority of that containment still along that entire southern edge of the fire. That's an area that's been wrapped up for quite some time. Areas where I love to see some of that new containment is on the western area around Westwood. So that was one spot where we did have some concern earlier when those northerly winds were pushing that hotspot, what appeared to be closer to Westwood. Looks like we have containment there. Hoping to see that area north of Lake Almanor turn into fully contained in the next couple of days. Just given the current hotspots, it looks like we're trending in the right direction there. Much less heat activity than the last time we looked at that map. So hoping to see that turn into the black line, which represents where it's contained. Some of the spots where it's great to see that containment all the way around Chester and then north of Quincy as well. And then on the entire western areas around Taylorsville, we do have that black line where we're contained. Key area that I hope we get some containment moving forward is that eastern perimeter around Taylorsville, because that is one section of the Dixie Fire where we do still have some concern, as we do still have some hot spots going on there. We did see some smoke coming off of there throughout the day today, so that's most likely the key spot that I'm watching on the Dixie Fire moving forward. So 40% containment there, some good increases since my last update. Still some key spots that we'd like to see turning into contain, but the good news is we have a large amount of resources on the Dixie Fire, which we'll take a look at in a second. First, I do just want to remind you that even though I'm mostly saying good news, and even though I believe a lot of the evacuation warnings and some of the orders have been lifted, I purposely don't stay updated with all those orders and warnings because I always think it's better for you guys to get that information just straight from the source. So I have the links for all the current evacuation warnings in the links in the description, so you can find those there. If we want to just take one quick look at it, that's the snapshot of the Dixie Fire. You can see anywhere red, that is where you still have an evacuation order, and then that yellow is where it has transitioned to evacuation warning. So looks like we did get some of the orders lifted around where all of those turned into orders when we had that hotspot going into areas like Janesville. Looks like some of those have been lifted. So if you want the most recent updates on those, you can click the link in the description. And great to see around Lake Almanor, places like Chester and where we have a lot of those structures on the northern shore of Lake Almanor, they actually don't even have warnings anymore. It looks like they are just normal conditions. So great to see the improvement in that area right there. So going back to this list, now I do want to see, we've talked about the containment, and one of the key things that will determine how that containment grows in the future is when it comes to our current resources. You can see that we do have 19 helicopters, 429 engines, 211 dozers, 182 water tenders, 6,000 personnel, and 99 crews. So lots and lots of resources still on this fire, still 6,000 personnel, which is surprising because we do still have a large amount of other wildfires going on across the state. Now, where some of the bad news does come in is you can see that that number has increased. We are now up to 1,259 structures destroyed, and I do have the structure map somewhere in here. You can see how many different links that I have on all my fire weather videos. If we look at the structures destroyed for the Dixie Fire, I would imagine, so you can see that the majority of the structures that were destroyed from the Dixie Fire were in that Greenville area, but I think where the recent structures destroyed have been were from that hotspot that went into the Janesville area. You can see that does look to be where we've updated this information, where the damage assessment teams came back. Last update, we didn't see all these structures destroyed in the middle of this spot fire. You can see if you were to click on this map, you can actually see some of the photos where key things that you always notice in these photos is how hot the fire must have been as it came through, because in most of these photos there will be just absolutely nothing standing. And then the other thing you notice is how many trees are usually around a lot of these structures that destroyed. So it gives an idea for some of the dry fuels that we had that were able to lead to some of this active fire behavior. But it does look like that's been updated as well. Where you see those black structures, that's where there's no damage. Where you see the red structures, that's where they say that greater than 50% of the structure was damaged. But if you actually look at the photos, most of the time it looks like about 100% of the structure. So as always, my thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who has been affected by not only the Dixie Fire, but all the other fires going on throughout California. We are going to be taking another look at the Caldor Fire later in this video, and that is unfortunately another fire where we have seen a large number of structures destroyed. But first, I just want to make sure we get a good look at the fire weather forecast, because that is something that's going to affect how these fires change moving forward. And overall, I would say that this is where some of the good news comes in. You can see that for the last couple of days, we've had somewhat of a troughing pattern. And actually, before I get into this, I will just say that apologies if anybody's asking questions in the live chat or anything. I'm trying to get out as much of the concise, important information as I can right away, and then I plan on looking at the live chat and answering any questions that you may have posted in there. But back to the fire weather forecast, this is actually where some of the good news comes in. You can see that just basically a troughing pattern right here, which means lower temperatures and an increase in relative humidity. You can also see that that leads to some onshore winds, which pushes some moisture in from the ocean. And I know this always kind of goes both ways, where in the past we've seen a trough come in and then it brings some gusty winds. We end up getting a red flag warning because it's so windy. But overall, this trough looks much weaker than some of the other low pressure systems we've seen in the past. So not seeing those extreme winds that we have seen with some similar systems in the past, just some cooling temperatures. So good news there for the next few days, as we'll most likely have cooler temperatures, an increase in relative humidity, and not seeing those extreme wind gusts that we have seen in the past. Now, with that being said, it does look like we're going to be shifting back to a more typical summer pattern for California as we get into Thursday and Friday. That's where our ridge builds in, which means our temperatures will be rising up as we get into Thursday and then working into the weekend. But at first glance, it looks like the winds are going to be relatively weak as that comes in. So although the rise in temperatures and the decrease in relative humidity would theoretically lead to an increase in behavior, I always think the number one thing to look at is winds, and it doesn't look like we're going to have extreme winds when that ridge builds in. So we might end up just getting one of those thick smoke inversions over our fires, which actually cool the temperatures down and then reduce fire behavior. So overall, I would say fire weather forecast looking fairly good. You can see that still seeing some gusty winds over the Dixie Fire right now. That pretty much paints the picture of why we still have a large amount of activity going on the northwestern section of the Dixie Fire and that area around Taylorsville. It's because even though we are getting into the evening hours, we do still have some of those strong southwesterly winds. You notice big difference. We're no longer seeing those northerly winds that we were seeing last Thursday, where the fire was being pushed down to the south. Now it's more back to those typical patterns over the Dixie Fire, where we have those southwesterly winds. Now, good news, those winds will be calming down overnight, so firefighters should be able to get some containment overnight, some control over the fire. Temperatures dropping down into the low 50s as well. That's one thing I've noticed over the last couple days, is the overnight temperatures have been much cooler than in the past, and relative humidity going up to 50%. Still very dry over that northwestern section. So unfortunately, when it comes to that northwestern section, likely to continue to see some fire activity overnight as that area of the fire does remain dry. Now, key thing I'm looking at is what we're going to be looking like for tomorrow. Looks like we do still have some dry conditions over the Dixie Fire where we have relative humidity in the low teens in some places, but slightly more humidity than we're used to in other places, but still definitely on the dry side in the mid-teens to low 20s. And then when it comes to the temperature, as I was saying, as that trough builds in over the next couple of days, right there, you can see that trough building in. That basically brings some cooler temperatures with it. So you can see forecast high for tomorrow, at least in this area. I tried to click relatively close to where we're seeing some of those hot spots, just around mid 70s, possibly low 80s in some other places, but that's certainly an improvement on those mid 90s that we had in the past. Now, the big question mark when it comes to fire activity is always, what are the winds going to be doing? And it looks like tomorrow afternoon, just like today, we do have those strong southwesterly winds that are typical during the afternoon hours over the Dixie Fire, where during the morning hours you have those winds going down canyon. During the afternoon hours they start to pick back up going southwesterly. So does look like, even though the temperature and humidity are better than in the past, we are still going to have those winds in the afternoon. So we will likely continue to see that activity continue on that hotspot on the southeastern edge of the fire, but then especially on that northwestern section of the fire where it's going to remain dry overnight, which means some activity can continue overnight, which means in the early morning hours, and then as we get into the afternoon, those winds will pick up and lead to some more growth in that area as well. Now, with all that being said, let's take a look at what the WRF Fire model is predicting for the Dixie Fire. If you're new to these videos, this is something that we always look at. This is the model that we put out from the San Jose State Fire Weather Research Laboratory, and it basically, I might be a little biased saying this because right now I'm earning my master's in meteorology from San Jose State underneath the Fire Weather Research Laboratory, but it is one of the top wildfire models in the world. It basically combines the fire perimeter and some of those active hotspots with the fuel, weather, topography variables, and then something that sets this model apart is it also simulates how the wildfire creates its own weather and then how that weather ends up impacting the wildfire. So, key thing that I always remind people of is this is an experimental forecast only. So you can sometimes take this with a grain of salt because it doesn't take into account fire suppression tactics, but it is always great to look at this because it paints a good picture of how the winds and the fire interact. So down here you see a clock. This is showing the early morning hours. You could tell it's early morning because you have those down canyon winds, and that I'll actually show that again just in case you missed it. You can see those down canyon winds in the early morning, about 9-10 a.m., and then right when you get to about 11 or 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, those winds shift around, and that's what we've been talking about throughout this entire fire weather forecast, seeing those southwesterly winds in the afternoon, certainly picking up on that area where we see those hotspots around Taylorsville. That is why that's going to be one of the key areas that I continue to watch moving forward. And then we also see those southerly winds pushing the fire forward on that northern edge as well. That looks to be one of the areas of the fire where we have the strongest winds. And then one thing that I always like to do is you zoom out here, take a look. You can just fast forward to see where that fire growth is expected. Actually, it might be easier to zoom in and look at this. So that's what the model is predicting over the next 48 hours. If we go back to the beginning, you can see where the current fire perimeter is, and then if you go back and forth, you can see a basic estimate of where the fire is predicting more growth. Not a big surprise there. It's where we have those two active hotspots on the Dixie Fire. That southeastern edge and that northwestern edge is where the model is predicting more growth in the future. And if I had to put my opinion, I would imagine we actually see a little bit more growth on this northern side than the model is currently predicting, just given how many hotspots we have right there and the fact that we are going to have some strong southwesterly winds in the afternoons. But again, moving forward, overall forecast is looking much better than in previous days. And then we are going to have to keep an eye on as we get into Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because we are going to return to some warmer conditions where we're back into the mid 80s with some relative humidity, back into the low teens and single digits. Good news is, as of right now, this system doesn't look like it's going to be very windy, but we're certainly going to have to keep a close eye on it because it does look like we're trending back towards more critical fire weather conditions towards the end of this week. The big question mark there, again, will just be what happens with those winds, though. But quick summary of the Dixie Fire. Big news is that it is up to 725,000 acres, so remaining at the number 2 largest wildfire in the history of California. We have seen some activity throughout the day today, especially on that northwestern section and that southeastern section. Certainly picked up in the afternoon hours. That's where we see the hotspots on the Dixie Fire right now. So that's the areas we are going to keep an eye on moving forward, especially that area around Taylorsville. But again, I know that CAL FIRE has positioned a large amount of resources in this area. They're currently working on some containment lines, trying to keep those hotspots out of Taylorsville. Now, where some of the great news comes in on the Dixie Fires, compared to my last forecast, which was last Thursday. Again, apologies for the absence Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, but had to take a little time off for personal reasons. The great news on the Dixie Fire is north of Lake Almanor. Remember my last update on Thursday, we had lots of hot spots going on right here. We had northerly winds pushing it closer towards Lake Almanor. We had hot spots to the east of Westwood that were moving closer towards Westwood. We had hot spots that at one point in time looked like they were getting close to Susanville, and then we also had that spot fire that had moved into Janesville. And in all of those areas, you can see much reduced activity compared to last Thursday. So in those areas, we are certainly trending in the right direction. Dixie Fire looking much better than in the past. But I think I am going to keep a very close eye on this hotspot right here near Taylorsville, because that does look to be one of the key areas to keep our eye on for the Dixie Fire moving forward. Now, the next fire that we're going to talk about is the Caldor Fire. I'm going to take one quick sip of water before we get into this one. But you can see that this was one of the more active fires today, and actually over the last couple of days. Lots of smoke coming off of that fire as of right now. Alrighty, so it's time to officially get into the Caldor Fire. If you're new to the live stream, we just went over the Dixie Fire, so you can go back and watch that if you're interested in that one. Now I do want to focus on the Caldor Fire because, as you can see, this was the most active fire throughout the day today, and actually over the last couple days as well. And I think this is one of the ones where I have the majority of my concern moving forward. As you can see, how much activity is still going on this one. One thing we didn't look at for the Dixie Fire, but we can take a quick peek at, is that natural color fire, where you can see where the active fire activity is. Paints a pretty similar picture to what we were saying for the Dixie Fire. A lot of that heat on the northwestern section, but you can see how much heat is going on over the Caldor Fire, and especially on that northeastern section there. But taking one last look at the satellite imagery, certainly a lot of smoke coming off of the Caldor Fire today. If we want to see what the fire perimeter looks like on the Caldor Fire, and then also what the active hotspots look like. So that's the fire perimeter. You can see the hotspots over the last 24 hours is where you see those red dots right there. So we did have some activity on the western edge, which is certainly not, we don't want to see that activity on the western edge, because you can see how many thousands of structures are to the west of the Caldor Fire. One thing I will say, though, is I did hear numerous reports from CAL FIRE that they were talking about firing operations on this western edge. So there is a chance that some of that hot spot activity was from previous firing operations, but that's also something to keep in mind moving forward, is if you start to see more hotspots showing up here, it could be some of those firing operations that CAL FIRE has planned and has been preparing for over the last 24 hours. But you can see clearly where most of the growth has been on the Caldor Fire. It's on that northern, northeastern, and eastern edge where you see the large amount of those hotspots. And it's always good to look at where the current hotspots are. And this is why I think I'm actually more concerned about the Caldor Fire than the Dixie Fire right now. Again, I never want to downplay a fire, but you have to prioritize things at some point. And I would say that the Caldor Fire has now moved into the top priority for California. There could be some disagreement there, but just based on how much fire activity and current hotspots, Caldor Fire is certainly the fire where we're seeing the most activity right now. Now, unfortunately, we do see some of those hotspots on that western edge there, getting close to a lot of these structures that we see. Now, one thing that I will remind again is CAL FIRE does have some firing operations planned there, so hard at this point and just based on this map to know if that's just active wildfire that's burning out of control or if it is those helpful firing operations that are able to remove some of the fuels and actually protect those structures in the future. Now, one thing I do remember, I watched the update on the Caldor Fire not too long ago, and they did say it hasn't moved west of Sly Road, so that is some good news there. But one update that we did see on this northeastern section was that it was able to cross Highway 50. I believe if we zoom in here, you can see where Highway 50 is. I believe it's that line right there, and you can see where we had that spot fire, where basically what happens there is a burning ember from the main fire is picked up by the wind. It was thrown over Highway 50, and then it grew ever since there. Now, from that Caldor update that I was listening to earlier, they said that they did have that spot fire relatively contained on the northern edge and the eastern edge, but they said they were still expecting that spot fire to grow more to the west there, and then the overall fire expecting to grow much more to the northeast and east. As you can see how much activity we have going on right now, and as we're looking at with the winds mostly going to be from the southwest, which will continue to push that fire farther up to the northeast. But we'll take a good look at the fire weather forecast in just a second. So do want to update the numbers on the Caldor Fire because this is unfortunately where we had some big increases since my last update. You can see that the Caldor Fire is up to 114,000 acres burned, 9% containment, which is actually surprising considering how much activity we have had on the Caldor Fire. Amazing that we've gained any containment. And actually, I want to see if there's a map that shows where that containment is. Usually you can find it. I think this one will show it. So where you see the red line is going to be where it's uncontained, where it shows the black line is where the fire is contained. So, just waiting for it to load here. You can see, so this was their original plan on the Caldor Fire, was to gain some containment on that southern edge, use that as what's called an anchor point, and then once you gain that containment, then you can start working up the sides. It's called trying to flank the fire, and then hopefully just start to gain more and more containment on based off of that anchor point in the days ahead. So looking at that southern edge, you can see that's where there's basically no hotspots remaining. That is where it looks like we have that containment, but clearly fair bit of work still to be done on the Caldor Fire, as 91% of that fire perimeter is uncontained at this point. So that's some concerning news when it comes to the numbers for the Caldor Fire. The fact that we are up to 114,000 acres and still only 9% contained. One thing also that is a concern is the evacuation orders that are in place, still a large number of them. I believe I put the link for this in the description, so if you go to it, you can find out some of those recent evacuation warnings and orders. And then where some of the bad news does continue on the Caldor Fire is you can see that this number has ticked up quite a bit since the last update. It is up to 615 structures destroyed. And if we want to see where that is, we can go to the fire perimeter, and where you see these orange dots, I'll flash them on and off so you can see where they are. You can see that large number of structures. I believe that's called Grizzly Flats right there, where I did see some footage coming out of this area where we had it looked like almost all the structures in this area were destroyed. So again, as always, thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who has been affected by not only the Caldor Fire, but all the other wildfires burning in California. And I think one of the key spots that I'm going to be looking at moving forward is that western edge. It sounds like they have some plans in place for firing operations, structure protection, and containment lines, but we do see those hotspots much closer to those structures than we'd like to see. So I'm certainly going to be watching this map very closely. And what I'm hoping right now is that this heat that's coming off is just due to some of those firing operations that Cal Fire was talking about, because if it's not, it does look like the Caldor Fire has continued to move west compared to the previous fire perimeter. But that is something that, again, you have to always take this map with a grain of salt, because it is a satellite picking up these heat signatures from space. We've seen in the past that it's not always completely accurate, but just given that map right there, it looks like there could be some concern on that western edge of the Caldor Fire. But don't want to jump to any conclusions there, as I do know they were planning some firing operations in this area, which would send off similar heat signatures. But certainly going to have to keep an eye on that spot and the eastern and northeastern edge of the Caldor Fire as well. Last thing we want to see is for it to continue to move farther and farther up to the northeast. You can see how many structures we have up here. So I think there's really two spots that we're really going to have to keep an eye on. It's that western section and that northeastern section that appears to be moving farther up, closer to where we see those structures on the south shore of Lake Tahoe and working between Lake Tahoe and where the Caldor Fire is right now. Now, when it comes to the resources on this fire, this is something we haven't looked at yet, but we can see for the first time: 19 helicopters, 211 engines, 51 dozers, 24 water tenders, over 2,000 personnel, and 48 crews. Now, I remember a time on the Caldor Fire when it was that day that it grew from 6,000 acres to 50,000 acres in one day, and we still only had 242 personnel on the fire. You can see big change in that department over the last few days, now up to over 2,000 personnel on the Caldor Fire, which is great to see there. Now, one thing that we can do, because the big question mark, we talked about those two areas that we are concerned about, that western edge and that northeastern edge. The best way to know what those areas are going to be doing is to look at the fire weather forecast, and then we can also take a look at the WRF S-Fire simulation for the Caldor Fire. But when it comes to the fire weather forecast, this is a little trick you can do. You take the lat lon from the Cal Fire website, you go to windy, type it in right here, and then it brings you right into where you have that wildfire. So let's go back to right now. I'm curious to see what the winds are looking like right now. So relatively calm winds right now. So although based on the satellite imagery, we had a large amount of smoke coming off of this afternoon and this evening, we should start to see the fire calm down as we get overnight, as our winds start to calm down and calm down even more as we get into 2 a.m. temperature dropping back down in the 50s, and then relative humidity up into the 50s as well. So looks like we are going to have some calming conditions overnight, where hopefully they'll be able to increase some of that containment, reduce some of that heat activity that we were seeing on the Caldor Fire right now, which did look like a lot of heat currently going on. But then getting into tomorrow afternoon, I think it'll actually be easier to understand the weather forecast if I just zoom out here 1 second. The overall pattern over California is this trough that you can see is going to be moving in through Tuesday, through Wednesday. And what that is going to be doing is bringing cooler temperatures and bringing some increase in relative humidity as well, which is good for our wildfires. You want cool temps, you want an increase in relative humidity. The reason for that is the more moisture that's in the air, the more moisture can find its way in those finer fuels, and the calmer the fire will be. And the good news is, as of right now, it doesn't look like we're going to have extreme winds associated with that low. So that's some good news right there, that we're not seeing that red flag warning potential like we had last week. And then moving in to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, it does look like we transition back to a more typical summer pattern for California, where we get that ridging, where you get warm temperatures with some low relative humidity. So that would act to increase fire behavior as we get into Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But as of right now, it looks like we're going to have very weak winds when that high pressure system moves in. So hopefully what ends up happening is we just get a thick smoke inversion over our fires like we've had in the past, and then it calms the fires down and actually cools our temperatures down, as well as if you get that smoke thick enough over a fire. We've seen this in the past where the forecast will be for maybe 95 degrees, and then because of that thick smoke layer, it only ends up being about 72 degrees. So just going into tomorrow, this is the high for tomorrow. You can see we're in the 70s. So that's the impact of that trough that's moving in that I was talking about, bringing some cooler conditions and some really just better conditions for calming our fires down, which is actually something we've seen over the last couple days as well. Not as extreme as those red flag warning days we were seeing in the past, but when it comes to temperatures, that is still relatively on the warm side. So don't get me wrong, we will still continue to see some growth on the Caldor Fire, but I think I'm feeling better because it's not the extreme conditions that we had last week. So temperatures mid-70s, relative humidity in the 20s, which is actually fairly good comparatively to some of those days where we're in the single digits with our relative humidity. But the big question mark is the wind gusts, and it does look like we're still going to have those afternoon wind gusts, and especially on the northeastern section of the fire where it's 25, 30 miles per hour in some of those drainages and canyons. So that is, I think, so temperature and relative humidity is where we have some good news in the forecast. Where the bad news comes in is we do still have some of those 25 mile per hour wind gusts from the southwest, which will continue to try to push this fire farther to the northeast. So that is why one of the key spots I'm watching on this fire is that northeastern section, moving into what looks like a large amount of structures up there. Now, one thing we also see on the Caldor Fire is there's a certain point in the day where it looks like the winds almost shift around. This usually happens where the winds shift around and start to move west, and that's where we start to get some concern for the western edge of the fire. So I think the best way to see that, actually before I show the simulation, I will just fast forward so you can see that Friday. You believe me that we are going to see a significant warm-up as we get into this weekend, where we're back into the 90s, which means our relative humidity, unfortunately, back into the low teens to single digits. So that will likely lead to an increase in fire behavior as we get into Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But the good news is with that high pressure system, our winds will be calming down. So what I'm hoping for is that we just get that smoke that sits over the fire, which actually reduces your temperatures because the solar radiation can't break through that thick smoke, and then it ends up calming the fire down. That's going to be the key thing that we're going to be watching as we get later into the week. But with all that being said, I do want to see what the WRF Fire model is predicting for the Caldor Fire over the next 2 days. Again, this is, so if you're new to the live stream, this is the model that's put out by the San Jose State Fire Weather Research Laboratory. It's one of the top wildfire models in the world. It combines the fire perimeter and those active hotspots with the fuel, weather, topography variables over the next 2 days to create a simulation and a prediction of where that fire activity is going to be. Now, the big disclaimer is that it's an experimental forecast only, and the key thing is it doesn't take into account fire suppression tactics. So oftentimes you see more fire growth simulated than we actually end up seeing, but it's a good indication of what that fire behavior would look like if we did not have resources on that fire. So it's a good thing to gain perspective for how lucky we are to have those 2,000 personnel on the Caldor Fire. So without further ado, let's click play and see where the model is predicting that growth. You can see where it's simulated that hotspot right, or that spot fire. Just want to go back and look at that again. I'm going to pause it, start it over, because it's actually a perfect illustration of what happened and how that northern section of the Caldor Fire was able to jump Highway 50. We had a burning ember picked up by these winds blowing from the south right there, threw it over Highway 50, and then grew. And you can actually watch how that happens right there. Spot fire jumps Highway 50, starts to grow throughout the day. And then if we back up here, you can see this was what was predicted throughout the day today. I would say this was pretty spot on, mostly southwest winds throughout the day today, leading to an increase in growth to the northeast right there. And then as we get into the overnight hours tonight, there's that wind shift I was talking about where it sometimes pushes to the west. And that's where the model does predict some increase in growth on the western edge of the fire. But again, that's where you have to take it with a grain of salt, because that's where it doesn't take into account fire suppression tactics. And then as we get into the afternoon hours again tomorrow, you see those winds shift back to the southwesterly direction, predicting more growth, and especially on that northeastern and eastern edge of the fire, where the fire perimeter and the winds align, and then the winds shift back, pushing to the west again. So just looking at that, compared to the start of the fire, you can see where the model is predicting growth. I would say most likely going to come true on that northeastern and eastern section, where we have a lot of hot spots going on right now, and we do have those southwesterly winds. Where I expect to see less growth than the model's predicting is on this western section, where we have a large amount of resources in here, putting in some lines, using structure protection. We have a number of firing operations planned as well, which will hopefully tidy up that western section and lead to less growth than what that model is predicting. But again, I would say likely to continue to see growth on that northeastern section, so that's certainly the area of the fire where I'm going to be watching very closely over the next couple of days, and definitely keeping an eye on that western section as well, because hard to tell if these hotspots going on right now are active wildfire or those firing operations that Cal Fire was talking about. So definitely going to keep my eye on there over the next couple of days. But the overall summary for the Caldor Fire, you can see that that one is up to 114,000 acres. Lots of growth over the last few days. The kind of concern in the forecast is that we do have a large amount of activity still going on the Caldor Fire, even though we've had some more favorable conditions over the last couple of days. Just based on that satellite imagery throughout the day today, you can see it really started to pick up this afternoon. A couple of pyrocumulus clouds going off there. You can see where the smoke is coming off on the western edge certainly looks less intense than where it's coming off on that eastern and northeastern edge, where just a massive amount of smoke finding its way into the Tahoe area. Now, I believe we actually have one, we can look, I'm going to restart this. I want to look at 6 hours. This is the one camera we were originally watching on the Caldor Fire at one of the first days when it started to really take off. That this camera just looked like nothing we've seen throughout this entire season. And I want to click back to the beginning there to look at what the Caldor Fire actually looked like throughout the day today. This pretty much paints the picture. We had a large amount of fire activity, a couple of pyrocumulus clouds popping up there where you see that white puffy area on the very tops of the smoke plume. But overall, I'd say it looks less intense than that one day where it went from 6,000 acres to 50,000 acres, where we just had a gigantic smoke plume. You could see a number of spot fires, but just looking at this imagery and matching it up with the current hotspot map, you can see that there is still a large amount of activity going on the Caldor Fire, even though we are getting into the overnight hours. Still seeing active flame, actually some fairly large flame lengths right there. And unfortunately, going to continue to see those gusty afternoon winds tomorrow afternoon as well from the southwest, so we will continue to see that northeastern push. What I'm really hoping for is that we can tidy up that western section, but you can see Caldor Fire, unfortunately, still quite active. Not as active as that day where it went from 6,000 to 50,000. That was the day where we had the red flag warning. We are seeing better conditions right now over the Caldor Fire, but as you can see, even into the overnight hours, certainly still seeing a fair amount of fire activity. Big question mark moving forward for the fire weather forecast is how strong those southwesterly winds are going to be in the afternoons that are acting to push that fire more to the northeast. And then as we get into Friday, big question mark is going to be how hot is it actually going to end up being? And then will the winds be weak enough as we get into Thursday, Friday, Saturday for that smoke to just sit over the fire and then actually diminish our temperatures and reduce fire behavior like we have seen in the past on a number of fires throughout the season. So that's the big thing I'm going to be watching for the Caldor Fire moving forward, as well as how close it gets to some of these structures on the northeastern section here and any advancements that it might make on this western section as well. Key thing I'll maybe wrap up the Caldor Fire by saying is that number of evacuation orders are still in place. I believe I put the links for that in the description, so be sure to stay updated with this one because it is the fire where we are seeing the most active growth right now. So one fire I do want to look at, this is one that we actually haven't talked about yet, and in complete honesty, I haven't done that much research on yet, so we're going to do the research in real time here. It's on the French Fire that you can see looked like it was calmer this morning, but then as we got into the afternoon hours, really started to kick up in activity, started seeing that smoke coming off. I want to see what the active hotspots look like on that one. First, let's go to the fire perimeter because it'll be easier to find on the map of California. Looks like that is the French Fire right there. And the reason that this is a big concern in California is you can see large number of structures around where the French Fire is. Again, the structures are those orange dots that I'm flashing on and off right here. And you can see the large amount of structures just on the northern section of the French Fire. And unfortunately, that's also where we have the largest amount of hotspots. Now, I'm almost hesitant to look at where the live hotspots are right now. Yeah, that was exactly what I didn't want to see. So, does look like there are those hotspots on the French Fire right now are directly over where those structures are. Now, one thing that I will say is that we have seen errors on these hotspots in the past, so you can sometimes take this with a grain of salt because, again, it's a satellite picking up heat signatures from space, and it's through a fairly thick smoke layer, that smoke that was being produced throughout the day today. So can't 100% guarantee that that whole area below that hotspot is seeing active fire, but that certainly does create some cause for concern. And we're certainly going to have to keep an eye on what's going on in this area underneath that hotspot, and then also to the communities to the east of the French Fire, where if we actually zoom in there, again, I probably shouldn't even do this because the hotspots are up for debate, and as we've seen, not perfect, but it looks like hotspot to that community just about a mile, so we're going to have to keep a very close eye on that one. Good news is conditions will be calming down overnight as our temperatures drop, our relative humidity rises, and our winds drop, but that's going to be a key spot to look at as we move forward over the next couple of days because you can see how close that hotspot is to those communities. And I actually want to look at what those communities are. Again, I'm researching the French Fire in real time during this live stream. I haven't had much time to be able to look at this one, but it looks unfortunately like those structures to the north or under that hotspot that we're seeing right there, it looks like that is Shirley Meadows right there. And then to the east where we see those the large amount of structures, that looks like it's, I shouldn't even try to pronounce this, Wofford Heights. I probably am saying that wrong, so apologies there, but looks like that's going to be one of the key spots that we look at moving forward. Wofford Heights and Shirley Meadows moving forward, because it does look like we still have a fair bit of heat coming off of the French fire right now. And we could see that activity going on throughout the day today. And the conditions for tomorrow are looking fairly similar to what they were today. But when it comes to the French fire, you can see this one is up to 15,000 acres and 15% containment. Interested to see how many personnel. Actually, almost 1,000 personnel, which is more than I was expecting, considering we have 6,000 on the Dixie and 2,000 on the Caldor. Somehow managed to find another 1,000 personnel for the French fire. And just looking in here, you can see warmer temperatures in this area than our other fires. Dixie Fire, I believe, was in the mid 70s. This fire was in the around 90 degrees. So that gives you an idea of why we had more activity on this one. Relative humidity in the teens as well. So looking at this is a big thing to look at. The warming and drying trend will continue through Tuesday. Afternoon humidity will drop into the teens. So one thing we can look at for the French fire, we can use our little trick where we take the latitude and longitude, put it into windy to check out what the fire weather forecast for the French fire will be. Got to delete the word latitude first. And that'll take us right down to where we see the French fire. You can see where we have Lake Isabella right there. So just zooming back out so you can see the wind streams a little bit better right there. You can see still relatively gusty conditions right now, which is unfortunate, but actually no, that's not right now. Right now shows about 15 miles per hour, so still somewhat windy, but certainly calmer than we were this afternoon. That's where some of the good news comes in, as our winds are going to be calming down overnight, hopefully allowing firefighters to get some structure protection, get some better containment around this fire. And then as we get into tomorrow afternoon, that's where some of the concern comes in, is because one, you can see that the winds are supposed to be about 25 to 30 miles per hour, but I would say even more concerning than the magnitude of the winds is the direction they're coming from. It looks like they're coming from the west, which is the exact opposite direction we'd want to see those winds coming from, because if the winds come from the west, that will try to push this hotspot farther to the east. You can think about how that works. The winds basically just push the fire forward, and as we've seen on fires like the Dixie Fire and the Caldor Fire, what that can also lead to is spot fires, where you get that burning embers in here picked up by those westerly winds, drop down, and then it leads to spot fires and more spread. So that's going to be, I think, the big concern moving forward for the French fire, is that wind direction throughout the day. Tomorrow afternoon, certainly going to be looking at that as those afternoon winds come in. And then you can also see that this is an area that's warmer than the Dixie Fire, already into the mid 80s there, relative humidity in the teens, so fairly challenging conditions when it comes to the French fire. So that's certainly going to be one that I keep a close eye on moving forward, because that, out of our fires, it looks like that has the most critical fire weather conditions over the next 24 hours. Now, as we go far off into the forecast, that's where all of our fires start to trend much warmer and drier. Not sure what's going on with the color right there. As we get into Thursday, Friday, Saturday, again, the trough that we have over California right now, that's going to be building into Wednesday, bringing cooler and more moist conditions to our fires up in Northern California. Not so much down where we have the French fire. You can see it's almost like it's under a ridge pattern right there, which is why we see those warm temperatures. But then as we get into Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that's where that ridge starts to build in, which means we're going to transition back to some warm, dry conditions over the state of California. The big question mark is what kind of winds we're going to have as those warm temperatures come in. Looks like we're still remaining around 25 mile per hour wind gusts in the afternoon for the French fire. So that is going to be one of the key fires that we continue to have in our rotation for the fires that we're covering throughout the state of California. This is the first time we've talked about it, but as you can see, just based on where the current hotspots are, where we have a lot of those structures, and what the winds are going to be doing throughout the day tomorrow, blowing from the west to the east, certainly going to be keeping a close eye on the French fire. Now, another fire that we were keeping a very close eye on was the Monument Fire, and the reason for that is because of how close it was to the area of Hayfork. And this is, again, my last update was Thursday. Apologies again for being absent on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Had some personal things, but going to be back throughout this entire week. You can see the reason we were talking about the Monument Fire so much last week is we had that northerly wind event, which you can see spread the Monument Fire farther down to the south. And the big concern there was all these structures that you see in Hayfork. And you can see where those red dots were. That's where we continued to have some of those hot spots yesterday. And it looks like that southern edge of the Monument Fire was remaining active yesterday, which is unfortunate news for the area of Hayfork, because we were hoping that the winds would shift around from the south, start spreading the fire back up into itself. But it does look like some of that heat did remain over the last 24 hours. Interested to see where the active hotspots are. Again, that is some cause for concern. It looks like we do still have some hotspots in the Burnt Ranch area, and unfortunately, hotspots in that Hayfork area. Big disclaimer here is, as I always say, those hotspots aren't a guarantee of where the fire actually is. In many cases, you might be getting some heat up in the mountains here, and then firefighters have done a great job of putting in structure protection and lines around these communities. So you can sometimes take that with a grain of salt. It's not saying everywhere underneath that fire square is actively burning, but that is why we are concerned still about the Monument Fire, is because still seeing a fair amount of heat activity in the same area where we have a large amount of structures. Now, where some of the good news comes in is it looks like we don't have very much heat activity going on around Junction City or the Weaverville area. That was an area that we were concerned about in the past. Again, things can flare back up, but does look like we're trending in the right direction when it comes to the Junction City and Weaverville area. But I will point out that we already did see a large amount of structures destroyed in the Junction City area, but key area that I'm watching on the Monument Fire moving forward is that southern spot, and I'm going to continue to watch these hot spots throughout the night tonight to see if that continues to move any farther south. Now, when it comes to the Monument Fire, big jump up in the acreage burned. You can see we're now up to 150,000 acres and 20% containment. Interested to see how many personnel we have. That is actually very surprising. Again, that's surprising because, as we showed earlier, Dixie Fire is 6,000 personnel, Caldor Fire is 2,000, French Fire has almost 1,000, and this fire, big increase from previous days, is now up to 1,700 personnel on the Monument Fire. Although I would say that does make sense given how close those hotspots are to a large amount of structures in the area of Hayfork. So certainly going to be following the Monument Fire closely over the next few days. When it comes to all those current evacuation orders and warnings, I put the links for that in the description, and you can find that below. Now, do just quickly want to go over some of the other fires that we have burning throughout the state. You can, as it transitions into nighttime, you'll be able to briefly see where the Mcfarland Fire, it jumped away just at the wrong time. You can see right there is where I believe we have that Mcfarland Fire still burning. Up to the north where you see that smoke coming off earlier today, that's where we have the river complex, and then you also have the smoke coming off of the Antelope Fire, which is still burning as well. So Mcfarland Fire, that's where there is some bad news and good news. Bad news is it is up to 118,000 acres. Good news is we're up to 68% containment. River Complex, that was one of the fires that was the most active. last week when we had that northerly wind event really cleared the smoke out and allowed that fire to take off. That one, you can see how much it grew since last week when we had all that increase in activity, up to 86,000 acres burned and still only 10% containment there. When it comes to the Antelope Fire, that one is up to 68,000 acres burned and 37% containment. So just looking at the satellite imagery for the state of California, you can see that overall, smoke-wise, we're looking better than we were at this time last week because we now have those predominantly southwesterly winds, which are blowing that smoke into Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, and actually as far north as Montana in some cases. So air quality for much of California improved from last week, although as the French fire has started to pick up, those southerly winds do act to push some of that smoke into the valley. So not completely out of the haze if you're in the Bay Area, Sacramento, or San Joaquin valleys. If we actually want to see where that air quality comes in, currently, no big surprise there. Over the Caldor Fire and Lake Tahoe is where we have the worst air quality. You can see how much smoke was coming off of the Caldor Fire throughout the day today. That was also the fire where we saw the most active hotspots, so not a big surprise that that's where we have the worst air quality. Turning on the legend, you can see that's where we're very unhealthy to hazardous air. And then as you get into Northern California, where you have the river complex, the Monument Fire, and the Dixie Fire, that's also where you get into that unhealthy air quality. Also see that unhealthy air in Southern California, partly affected by the French fire down there. Now, if we want to see a forecast for how that air quality is going to be changing over the next 24 hours, one thing to look at here, not sure why it's not playing. I'll reload it. Sometimes it reloads in the time between where I loaded these links and when I actually played this video. Looks like that one doesn't want to play, so doesn't look like we're going to be able to look at the French fire, but we can look at Northern California with the Caldor Fire, Dixie Fire. You can see most of the smoke that we see is coming off of the Caldor Fire as we get into tomorrow morning. But then tomorrow afternoon, we're going to start to see those onshore winds push in, and that's going to start to clear some of that smoke out of the Bay Area. And while we do still have some haze over the Bay Area, you can see the worst air quality is certainly over the Lake Tahoe, Caldor Fire area, and then directly under places like the River Complex, Dixie Fire as well. If we could look down into Southern California, again, that one doesn't want to load for whatever reason, but most likely would see something similar to what we're seeing on that southeastern edge of the Dixie Fire, where you have smoke, you get some of that unhealthy air, and then it's able to spread out throughout the state as well. But overall, once those onshore winds come in the afternoon, it should act to clear some of that smoke out of the Bay Area. So much better air quality there than in previous days. Biggest concern when it comes to air quality is certainly the Tahoe region, where it is very unhealthy to hazardous. If you have plans to go up to Tahoe, honestly, if it was me, I would probably cancel them at this point, because Caldor Fire does look like it's going to remain active, and with those southwesterly winds, it's just going to continue to push that smoke directly into Tahoe. Now, key thing that we're going to be watching when it comes to the Caldor Fire is that the fire itself doesn't move into the Tahoe area. You can see where we have a large amount of those structures on the southern shore of Lake Tahoe stretching down between Lake Tahoe and the Caldor Fire. That's, I would say, the key spot that I'm watching moving forward throughout California are those structures that we see right there. We're going to have those southwesterly winds in the afternoon, which continue to push that fire farther to the northeast. So keeping a very close eye there, keeping a close eye on this western edge of the Caldor Fire. Good news there is it sounds like we have some firing operations planned over the next 24 hours. Hopefully those are successful, able to clear out some of the fuels, get some good containment on this western edge, and protect those communities. Another big concern is on the French fire. This is a fire that we hadn't looked at in the past. It's easier to find if I turn on fire perimeters. So this is a fire that we hadn't talked about in the past, but I can guarantee this is going to be a fire we're talking about throughout the rest of this week. As you can see where those live hotspots are, it looks unfortunately like it's now moved over the structures in that area, and my big concern moving forward is tomorrow afternoon it looks like we have some gusts of about 25 miles per hour from the west, which will act to try to push that hotspot farther to the east. So we're going to have to keep a very close eye on the French fire moving forward because we do have a large amount of structures to the east. Now the good news I will say is we have 1,000 personnel on this fire now, so I can guarantee they're working hard right now and throughout tonight as the winds calm down to work on some structure protection, calm that fire down, and get some good containment as well. Now another area that I'm concerned about in California is that area around Taylorsville. I know this is a spot on the Dixie Fire where they're actively using direct suppression tactics, where they're just right on the front line of the fire, trying to keep that hotspot out of Taylorsville. Overall, looks like the fire weather conditions are going to be more favorable for the Dixie Fire and actually all of our fires over the next couple of days than in the past. I'll maybe take the French fire out of that. French fire does look like it has some challenging fire weather conditions tomorrow, but when it comes to Caldor, Dixie, and all the northwestern lightning fires, looks like we have better conditions than last week, which isn't really saying much because we had very critical conditions last week with that red flag warning. But on the Dixie Fire, I am going to keep a very close eye there, and then also keeping a very close eye on Hayfork with the Monument Fire, as it does look like some of those hotspots are getting closer to where we have structures in the Hayfork area. So again, not only for all the areas I just pointed out, but if you live near any of these wildfires, always important to stay updated with those evacuation warnings and orders. And then I think I will end with some kind of good news, the silver lining. I know it's always hard to find some silver lining when it comes to wildfire season in California, but compared to my last update, I'll remind you that on Thursday, we had a hotspot directly north of Lake Almanor. We had northerly winds. It was looking like it was going to be pushing that hotspot into these structures around Lake Almanor. We had a hotspot to the east of Westwood that was edging closer to Westwood. We, at one point, had large amounts of hotspots that at one point did look like they were going to start threatening Susanville. We had that spot fire that found its way into Janesville. And in all of those areas, you can see much reduced activity, partly thanks to that trough that has been building in and will continue to build in over the next 2 days, bringing some cooler conditions, bringing an increase in relative humidity, and we haven't had as extreme of wind gusts. So trending in the right direction when it comes to the Dixie Fire. I think there are certainly still some places that we're going to have to keep a very close eye on moving forward though. So again, I will be doing these updates every single day throughout this next week and maybe even throughout the rest of the wildfire season. I got my 3-day break in over the last 3 days. Hopefully that sustains me for the next couple of months, because I hate to say it, but we really are just getting into the peak of wildfire season. Our fuels are still critically dry, and we haven't really even gotten into the peak of when we start seeing those Diablo winds. So unfortunately, it's going to be a long wildfire season, but I will be here every step of the way. So you can click the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this, where we dive into all the updates on the wildfires and the fire weather forecast to predict where it's going to move in the future. And then you can also hit the notification bell so that you actually get notified when I go live, because in some cases, not so much tonight because we've had relatively calmer behavior than in previous nights. That's, again, not saying much. But there are some times where we're live and we're actively following hotspots as it's moving into a community. So that is where it does help to turn on the notification bell as well. I will say apologies to anybody who has been posting questions into the live chat or comments or cam or camera recommendations. I haven't been able to look at the live chat at all throughout this video because I really just wanted to get as much information out there as I could in as concise a manner as I possibly could. And the reason for that is I am on a limited time block today because at about 10 o'clock I have to get back to my job at KSBW, where I have to prepare my evening or nightly forecast for the Central Coast. So that is where I'm off to right now, get my forecast together for the 11 o'clock show. If you live in the Central Coast, you can watch that on KSBW Channel 8. And if you aren't on the Central Coast, then you can watch me again when we go live tomorrow evening to once again talk about how all the California wildfires are changing and look at the forecast for how they are going to continue to change into the future. Now, I hope this video is helpful. As always, thoughts and prayers go out to anybody who has been affected by these wildfires. Huge thank you to all the firefighters out there, and thanks for watching.